The silver fork was inches from Richard Halston's lips when the scream shattered the evening. "Don't eat that." The voice was high-pitched, desperate, and completely out of place amid the crystal chandeliers and murmured sophistication of the Grand Monarch ballroom. Richard's hand froze midair, the delicate pastel frosting of the cake catching the golden light as 200 pairs of eyes swiveled toward the source of the commotion. A boy, small, filthy, no older than 9, was sprinting directly toward the head table. His dirt-streaked hoodie hung loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. His sneakers, held together with what looked like electrical tape, slapped against the polished marble floor as he dodged a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. "Security!" someone shouted from the back of the room. But the boy didn't stop. His eyes, sharp, wild, and carrying a weight that no child should ever bear, were fixed on the slice of cake sitting before Richard Halston. He pointed at it with a trembling finger as 2 broad-shouldered security guards closed in from either side. "Please," the boy gasped, his chest heaving. "Please don't eat it. I saw them switch the plate." Richard felt his jaw tighten. Heat crept up the back of his neck as he became acutely aware of the cameras from 3 different news outlets capturing every moment of this spectacle. This was supposed to be his night, the culmination of months of planning, the Halston Foundation's annual gala, where he would announce a $50 million donation to children's hospitals across the country. Instead, he was being upstaged by what appeared to be a homeless child who had somehow slipped past security. The first guard reached the boy, thick fingers wrapping around his thin arm. The child yelped, not in fear, but in frustration. "You don't understand," he cried, twisting against the guard's grip. "You have to listen to me." Richard set down his fork with a deliberate click against the fine china. The sound was louder than it should have been in the suddenly silent room. He smoothed his silk tie and cleared his throat. "Remove him," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had spent 3 decades commanding boardrooms. "And find out how he got in. This is a private event." The words felt reasonable as they left his mouth. Measured, appropriate. This was, after all, a $20,000 plate dinner attended by senators, CEOs, and philanthropists whose combined net worth could purchase small nations. A dirty child screaming about switched plates was clearly disturbed, possibly dangerous, and absolutely needed to be removed before the evening was completely derailed. Yet even as security began dragging the boy toward the side exit, something cold settled in Richard's stomach, something that had nothing to do with the untouched cake before him. The boy's eyes found his across the expanse of white linen and flickering candles. They weren't the eyes of a troublemaker or a thief. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something terrible and was desperately trying to prevent it from happening again. What could possibly make a homeless child risk everything to crash a billionaire's private gala? Why is he so desperate to stop Richard from eating that cake? And what horror has he witnessed that drives his warning? If you want to discover the devastating secret this boy is carrying, subscribe now and keep watching, because what happens next will change everything. The evening had begun, as these evenings always did, with an almost theatrical display of excess. Richard Halston had arrived at the Grand Monarch Hotel at precisely 6:47 p.m. in the back of his midnight black Maybach, stepping onto a red carpet that had been rolled out specifically for the occasion. The historic downtown hotel, with its Beaux-Arts architecture and gilded columns, had hosted presidents and royalty for over a century. Tonight, it hosted Richard and the 300 guests who had paid handsomely for the privilege of dining in his presence. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of curated opulence. Crystal chandeliers, 17 of them, imported from Venice in 1892, cast prismatic rainbows across walls adorned with Renaissance-style murals. The tables were dressed in ivory linen that cost more per yard than most Americans earned in a day. Fresh arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas erupted from silver vases, their fragrance competing with the heady mix of expensive perfumes that filled the air. Dior, Chanel, Tom Ford. Richard could identify them all without looking, a skill honed through decades of navigating rooms exactly like this one. He moved through the pre-dinner reception with practiced ease, shaking hands and accepting compliments with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Senator Morrison praised his visionary leadership. Margaret Chen, heiress to a hotel empire, remarked on his generous spirit. David Kowalski, CEO of a tech conglomerate, clapped him on the shoulder and called him the man of the hour. Richard nodded, thanked them, and felt absolutely nothing. This was the peculiar numbness that had settled over him in recent years, a kind of emotional novocaine that dulled everything from joy to sorrow. He had built his empire from nothing, rising from a cramped apartment in Baltimore to the pinnacle of American success. He had graced the cover of Forbes 7 times. He had shaken hands with 3 presidents. He owned homes in Aspen, Monaco, and the Hamptons. And yet, standing in this glittering ballroom, surrounded by people who would have done anything for 5 minutes of his attention, Richard Houston felt only a profound and unshakable emptiness. The dinner itself was a 7-course affair prepared by a James Beard award-winning chef brought in from New York specifically for the occasion. Richard sat at the head table on a raised dais, positioned so that every guest could see him clearly. He cut his Wagyu beef with mechanical precision, sipped his Chateau Margaux without tasting it, and nodded politely at the conversation happening around him while his mind wandered to quarterly projections and acquisition targets. The weight of the silver fork in his hand was substantial, custom pieces commissioned for the event, each one worth more than some families' monthly grocery budgets. The irony was not lost on him, given that the evening's stated purpose was to raise money for hungry children. But Richard had long ago made peace with the contradictions of philanthropy. You had to spend money to raise money. You had to court the wealthy to help the poor. It was simply how the game was played. By the time dessert arrived, Richard was counting the minutes until he could deliver his keynote speech, accept the applause, and retreat to the solitude of his penthouse. The cake placed before him was a work of art, 3 layers of vanilla bean sponge with pastel buttercream frosting, garnished with edible gold leaf and fresh berries. It sat on a delicate china plate rimmed with platinum, a small placard indicating that it had been prepared by the pastry chef of a 3 Michelin star restaurant. Richard picked up his fork and prepared to take the obligatory bite for the photographers positioned along the far wall. That was when the boy appeared. "I said remove him," Richard repeated, louder this time, as the security guards struggled to control the thrashing child. But then the boy shouted something that made every person in the room stop breathing. They switched the plate, same thing they did at the shelter. His voice cracked with desperation and grief. "My little sister ate it. Lily ate it. She never woke up." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. His grip on the armrests of his chair tightened until his knuckles went white. Somewhere in the back of the room, a spoon clattered against a plate. Someone's hand had gone slack with shock. The sound was obscenely loud in the suffocating silence that followed. The boy wasn't shouting anymore. He had gone limp in the guard's arms, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as if he were no longer in this ballroom at all, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere terrible. "She was only 6, he whispered, and his voice carried across the silent room with devastating clarity. "She liked the pink plate because it matched her shoes, the new shoes Mama got from the donation box. She was so happy about those shoes." Richard's throat constricted. The fork he had been holding moments ago now lay abandoned on the table, and he found himself unable to look away from the child's face. "They brought cake to the shelter," the boy continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of suppressed trauma. "Said it was from a bakery that had extra. Lily was so excited. She never got cake except on her birthday, and we couldn't even afford a cake on her birthday, so she said it was like Christmas and her birthday and everything good all at once." He drew a shuddering breath. The guards had stopped trying to remove him. They stood frozen, still holding his arms, but their grip had loosened. One of them, a man with a thick neck and a Marine Corps tattoo visible on his wrist, looked like he might be sick. "I saw a man talking to the kitchen lady. He gave her money, lots of money, and then she switched Lily's plate for a different one, same cake, same pink frosting, but a different plate." Richard rose slowly from his chair. He wasn't aware of making the decision to stand. His body simply moved of its own accord. "I tried to tell Lily not to eat it," the boy said, and now his voice was barely audible. "But she was so hungry. We were always so hungry. And it was cake, real cake. She took one bite and smiled at me and said it tasted like strawberries." A woman somewhere in the room let out a small, choked sob. The sound seemed to break something loose in the boy, and suddenly he was speaking faster, the words pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. "She fell asleep right there at the table. I thought she was just tired. We were always tired too, tired and hungry and cold. But she didn't wake up when I shook her. She didn't wake up when the adults came. She didn't wake up in the ambulance. His voice broke entirely. He sagged against the guards, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a traumatized 9-year-old boy who had witnessed his sister's murder and had never received a single moment of help processing that horror. "The police said it was an accident," he whispered. "Said the cake was probably just bad, but I saw them switch the plate. I know what I saw. And tonight I saw the same thing, a man talking to a waiter, money changing hands, and then the waiter switched your plate, sir, the same way they switched Lily's." Richard's legs were moving before his brain caught up with his body. He stepped down from the raised dais, his $1,000 dress shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached the boy. The crowd parted before him like water before the bow of a ship. "Let him go," he said to the guards. His voice emerged as a rasp. "Sir, we should really." "I said let him go." They released the boy immediately. He stumbled slightly without their support, then straightened and looked up at Richard with those impossible eyes, eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and somehow retained a desperate, flickering hope that someone, somewhere, might finally listen. Richard turned to the assembled guests. He spotted his head of security near the exit and locked eyes with him. "Seal the room," he ordered. "No one leaves. No staff, no guests, no one, and get me the medical team now." The room erupted into confused murmurs. Senator Morrison rose from his seat, his face reddening with indignation. "Richard, surely you can't be serious. This is clearly some sort of—" "Sit down, James." The steel in Richard's voice could have cut glass. The senator sat. Richard turned to the head table, where the slice of cake still sat in its pool of golden chandelier light. He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, really seeing it. The innocent pastel frosting, the artfully placed berries, the tiny gold leaf catching the light like buried treasure. Then he looked at the wait staff lined up along the wall. Most of them stood with practiced poise, their faces masks of professional neutrality. But one of them, a young man with slick-back hair and a thin mustache, had gone pale as chalk. A fine tremor ran through his hands as he clutched his empty serving tray. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You," he said, pointing directly at the trembling waiter, "step forward. Let me ask you something. If you were in Richard's position, a man who almost dismissed a desperate child as a troublemaker, what would you have done? Would you have listened to the smallest voice in the room, or would you have let security drag him away and return to your cake? Take a moment and really think about it. Then drop your answer in the comments below, because what happens next shows exactly what kind of man Richard Houston truly is. The waiter's name was Marcus Webb, and by the time the medical team arrived to test the cake, he was visibly shaking. Dr. Ellen Vasquez, the on-call physician for the hotel, performed a rapid toxicology screening on a sample of the frosting. The room watched in absolute silence as she worked, her gloved hands moving with clinical precision. The only sounds were the soft beep of her equipment and the ragged breathing of Marcus Webb, who had been detained by security near the service entrance. When Dr. Vasquez looked up from her testing kit, her face was gray. "Potassium cyanide," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper, enough to be fatal within minutes of ingestion. The room exploded. Guests screamed. Someone knocked over a table in their rush toward the exit. Security personnel shouted for order while simultaneously trying to prevent a full-scale stampede. But Richard didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at the cake that had nearly killed him, that would have killed him if not for a homeless boy who had found the courage to scream the truth in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it. He turned slowly to look at Marcus Webb. The waiter had collapsed against the wall, his legs apparently unable to support him any longer. Sweat poured down his face, mingling with tears of terror. "Who paid you?" Richard asked. His voice was eerily calm. "And don't think about lying to me. My security team will have your phone records, your bank statements, and your entire life history within the hour. The only thing you can do for yourself now is tell me the truth." Marcus sobbed. The sound was ugly, broken, the sound of a man watching his life crumble into irredeemable ruin. "Victor Marsh," he gasped. "Victor Marsh paid me $50,000. He said it would just make you sick. He said it wasn't enough to kill anyone, he said." But Richard had stopped listening at the name. Victor Marsh, his former CFO, the man Richard had personally fired 18 months ago after discovering evidence of embezzlement, nearly $30 million siphoned from company accounts into offshore holdings. Richard had chosen not to press charges, believing that the public humiliation of termination would be punishment enough. He had even provided a generous severance package, hoping to avoid the spectacle of a criminal trial. And this was how Victor Marsh had repaid that mercy. Richard thought about the boy's sister, Lily, 6 years old, with pink shoes from a donation box and a smile that lit up at the sight of cake. Had Victor been practicing, testing his method on people he considered disposable, homeless children who wouldn't be missed, whose deaths would be written off as accidents or overdoses or simply the inevitable casualties of poverty? The thought made Richard's stomach lurch. He had known Victor Marsh for 15 years. They had shared dinners, played golf, celebrated promotions together. And all that time, apparently, a monster had been lurking behind those expensive suits and practiced smiles. Richard looked at the boy, at Caleb, though he didn't yet know his name. The child stood alone near the overturned table, watching the chaos unfold with an expression that was somehow both vindicated and utterly exhausted. He had done what he came to do. He had sounded the alarm, and this time, someone had finally listened. And in doing so, he had saved Richard's life. Something cracked open inside Richard's chest. Something that had been sealed shut for so long he had forgotten it existed. He walked toward the boy slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he reached Caleb, he did something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He knelt. The movement was awkward. Richard Houston hadn't knelt before anyone in decades, and his body protested the unfamiliar position. The fine fabric of his tuxedo pants, hand-tailored Italian, wool worth more than most people's monthly rent, pressed against the sticky floor where champagne had been spilled in the confusion. He could feel the cold seeping through the material, could smell the sharp alcohol mixing with the boy's unwashed scent of street-level survival. But he didn't care. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard Houston was looking at another human being and truly seeing them. Not as a business contact to cultivate, or a donor to charm, or an employee to manage. Just a person. A child who had suffered unimaginable loss and had still found the courage to try to prevent that suffering from happening to someone else. "What's your name?" Richard asked. His voice came out rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "Caleb," the boy whispered. "Caleb Porter." "Caleb," Richard tested the name on his tongue. "Caleb, I owe you an apology. I almost had you thrown out. I looked at you and saw a disruption, a problem to be managed. I didn't see you, and I'm sorry." Caleb's lower lip trembled. For a moment, he looked like he might cry or run or both, but then something shifted in his expression. A tiny crack in the armor he had built around himself to survive the streets. "You listened," he said quietly. "Nobody ever listens." Richard felt something hot prick at the corners of his eyes. When was the last time he had cried? At his mother's funeral, perhaps, nearly 20 years ago. He couldn't remember. He had spent so long being the man who never showed weakness, never admitted doubt, never allowed anything to penetrate the polished veneer of his public persona. "I'm listening now," he said, "and I'm going to keep listening, I promise you that." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of investigations, arrests, and revelations. Victor Marsh was apprehended at a private airfield outside the city, attempting to flee the country on a chartered jet. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just for the attempted assassination of Richard Houston, but for a pattern of criminal activity that stretched back years. Investigators discovered that Lily Porter's death had indeed been murder, one of at least 3 test runs Victor had conducted at homeless shelters and soup kitchens to perfect his method. Each death had been dismissed as accidental, tragic, unremarkable, because the victims were people society had already chosen not to see. The trial was swift and merciless. Victor Marsh received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Marcus Webb, who cooperated fully with investigators, received 5 years in a minimum security facility. The kitchen worker at the shelter who had switched Lily's plate was never found. She had disappeared shortly after the murder and was believed to have fled the country. But the legal proceedings, as satisfying as they were, paled in comparison to the transformation taking place in Richard Houston's life. He had taken Caleb home that first night, not to a hotel, not to a temporary shelter, but to his own penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. The boy had stood in the marble-floored entryway, staring at the soaring ceilings and priceless artwork with an expression of pure disbelief. "Is this real?" he had whispered. "It's real," Richard had assured him, "and for as long as you want it, it's yours too." The process of becoming Caleb's legal guardian was complicated by bureaucracy but simplified by Richard's resources. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was filed. Within a month, it was approved. For the first time since Lily's death, Caleb had a home. But Richard understood that a home was only the beginning. The boy needed therapy to process traumas that would have broken most adults. He needed education to catch up on years of sporadic schooling. He needed medical care, dental care, and the kind of nutrition that would help his undersized body finally begin to grow. Most of all, he needed something that no amount of money could directly buy: the simple, consistent experience of being loved. Richard threw himself into the task with the same intensity he had once reserved for building his business empire. He interviewed therapists until he found one who specialized in childhood trauma. He researched schools until he identified one with both academic excellence and a proven track record of supporting students from difficult backgrounds. He hired a nutritionist, a tutor, and a youth counselor. He restructured his entire schedule to ensure that he was home for dinner every night, something he hadn't done in decades. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, Caleb began to heal. The nightmares decreased. The flinching at sudden movements subsided. The boy who had once been unable to make eye contact gradually learned to meet Richard's gaze without fear. He laughed for the first time during a game of chess, a sound so pure and unexpected that Richard had to excuse himself to compose his emotions. But healing, Richard learned, was not a destination. It was a journey with no clear end. Some nights, Caleb would wake screaming his sister's name. Some days, he would retreat into a silence so deep that no amount of gentle coaxing could draw him out. And always, always, there was the weight of Lily's memory, the sister he had failed to protect, the pink-shoed girl who had trusted the world and been betrayed. It was during one of these difficult nights, as Richard sat on the edge of Caleb's bed and rubbed slow circles on his back, that the idea came to him. "I want to start a foundation," he said quietly, "in Lily's name, to protect other children like her, like you, to make sure that the people society throws away are never invisible again." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Richard with those ancient young eyes. "She would have liked that," he whispered. "She always wanted to help people. Even when we had nothing, she would share her food with the other kids at the shelter." Richard felt his heart crack open a little further. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll build something that would make her proud." The Lily Porter Foundation was announced 6 months to the day after the interrupted gala. Its mission was comprehensive: to advocate for homeless and at-risk children, to fund investigations into suspicious deaths at shelters and institutions, to provide legal resources for families failed by the system, and to ensure that no child's voice would ever go unheard simply because they lacked wealth or status. Richard committed $500 million of his personal fortune to the foundation's endowment. Other donors, inspired by the story and moved by the cause, contributed hundreds of millions more. Within its first year, the foundation had established chapters in 15 cities, trained over 1,000 advocates, and successfully pushed for legislation requiring enhanced death investigations at homeless facilities. But more than the money, more than the programs, more than the policy changes, what mattered most was the shift in Richard himself. He still ran his business empire, still commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, but something fundamental had changed. He listened more, he judged less, he looked at people, really looked at them, in a way he hadn't done since he was young and hungry and fighting his way up from nothing. And every morning, he woke up in a home that contained something he had never expected to find: a family. Caleb thrived. He caught up on his education with astonishing speed, displaying a natural aptitude for mathematics that his teachers said was exceptional. He made friends carefully at first, then with increasing confidence. He grew taller, filled out, began to look less like a ghost and more like a boy. And though he would carry the scars of his early life forever, they no longer defined him. They had become part of his story, not the whole of it. On the one-year anniversary of the gala, Richard and Caleb stood together at the dedication ceremony for the Lily Porter Children's Advocacy Center, the flagship facility of the foundation, built on the very site where the homeless shelter had once stood. "I still miss her," Caleb said quietly, looking up at the banner bearing his sister's name. "I know," Richard replied. "You always will. That's not weakness, that's love." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he slipped his hand into Richard's, a gesture so simple and so profound that it said more than any words could convey. "Thank you," he whispered, "for listening." Richard squeezed his hand. His vision blurred with tears he no longer felt ashamed to shed. "Thank you," he replied, "for having the courage to speak." This story taught us something important. True character isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the power of your title. It's measured by what you do when the smallest, most vulnerable voice in the room dares to speak the truth. Richard Houston had everything the world says should make a person successful, but it took a homeless boy with nothing but courage to teach him what really matters. If this story moved you, I want you to know there's another one coming that will hit just as hard. Next time, we'll tell you about a nurse who was fired for breaking protocol, until the patient she saved revealed a secret that brought an entire hospital board to its knees. Make sure you don't miss it. Subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when it drops. Until then, remember, the voices that matter most are often the ones we are tempted to ignore. Don't make that mistake.